Hi, everyone, and welcome to the session where we're going to be studying philosophical assumptions and their relevance to thinking about qualitative research. So in the earlier lecture, we talked about positionality. And again, positionality is really about where you situate yourself. And it's very a personal position. So we're not talking about it just in terms of the research, but it's more about who you are as a person. So my positionality would be as a cisgender Black woman who is has dual citizenship. I am highly educated. I come from a middle-class background. I speak English, but I grew up in a two-parent household and I'm married. And so all of those identity pieces, not just about how I think about those identity pieces, but more about how those identity pieces shift and give me power and privilege, or where they make me vulnerable and marginalized. And so we talked about that earlier. And what I want to build on that is the ways in which who our status is then reflects our professional identities. So here I'm showing a little bit more about my professional identities in terms of who I am as a researcher and how I view research and what are the approaches that I used when I'm doing that. So again, I'm going back to this model that we talked about earlier in qualitative research, where everything is circular and everything goes back. And so in terms of today's lecture, we're going to be talking about your philosophical assumptions and the ways in which your philosophical assumptions will impact every level of the qualitative cycle. And every cycle within the cycle will be shaped by that. And again, it's important to keep getting comfortable with that, especially if you're a quantitative researcher, because that's a really different way of looking at things. And so today we're going to be talking about what philosophical assumptions are, how they affect our research goals in terms of why we're doing the research, also the ways in which it shapes our data in terms of how we look at it and how we give meaning, and then also some common terms that are used in qualitative research as it relates to philosophical assumptions. So a lot of times, especially when we're trained from a quant lens, we don't really think about philosophical assumptions. We think about theories, which is different. This is not the same as a theory. It informs the way we look at theories, but this is more about how we look at research and how we approach research, drawing upon our research training. And so there's three reasons why we have to know about our philosophical assumption. And this is even when we're thinking about it in terms of quantitative research. First is, how do our philosophicals direct our research goals and outcomes? Also, our research training and experience really will shift our philosophical assumptions and shape them. So you can think about that if you have colleagues in different fields, how they view things might be slightly different by their training. And then there's also points of overlap. And then also our philosophical assumptions really give us a tool for evaluating or critiquing the ways in which we come to creating knowledge or understanding what we've learned. So when you think about this, it changes. Our philosophical assumptions, what we came in for grad school, will probably have completely changed by the end. It doesn't mean that we were wrong, but the ways in which we look at things will change as we get more information through our training. And that's a great way of looking at things. And that's also a critical way of looking at things. So it will change over time, but it doesn't necessarily mean that one was wrong and the other was appropriate, but you have to keep thinking about it. Now, within our philosophical assumptions, there are different names. But what's really at the center of this is there a single absolute truth, or are there multiple truths? And your answer to that really is what shapes your philosophical assumptions. So how do we distinguish what is actual fact and what's not fact? And are there ways in which this information about facts have been created through the research process? Is that informed then by the ways in which research is done? So is it that we create knowledge, or is knowledge already there and we just discover it? All of these things are discussions that are really important to think about because it tells you about who you are as a researcher, but particularly as a qualitative researcher, it's important because, again, it's a central piece in the whole approach to which we do qualitative research. And I really love this figure, and we're going to come back to it. And you'll see that, again, we already talked about reflexivity in phase one. The second phase before you approach research is your philosophical assumptions. And you need to know how to articulate this before you move forward. And again, this is something when someone's doing research, I can cue in if they've really been trained, if they can articulate their philosophical assumptions in terms of how they make meaning, which is then about your strategies and your methods, methodology, etc. So again, when you're looking at the model of qualitative research, this is something that really has to be thought about, and you need to be able to articulate before you jump into just creating surveys and jumping into developing research. So when you think about your philosophical approaches, you need to think about your ontology and epistemology before you get to methodology, methods, and sources. And most people start off in methods, which is problematic because it's really sort of overlooking how do we come to understand what's out there? What is there that we know? And that's not just simply a literature review. It's also what do we know about how we think about things? So it's not just simply reviewing what the literature said is not there. That's easy. But what's out there to know? What do we already know about this phenomenon in terms of how we look at it and our frameworks and beliefs? Next is our epistemology, which builds on this framework. And it's like, what and how can we know about it? So it's not just what's out there, but how did we come to understanding what's out there? What are the frameworks in which we use to sort of figure this out? And then this is where you can then go to the methodology of how we can go about acquiring knowledge. How do we frame it? And so this, we're going to talk about methodology in upcoming weeks. And then where most people jump in is the methods. They say, I'm using qualitative, quantitative, observation, etc. And then sources, what sources of data are we using? But this ontology and epistemology are really critical for understanding how you're doing research and the ways in which you're approaching your studies, and it gives insights into what kind of researcher you are. So if you're looking at the ontology and epistemology features in terms of looking at quantitative versus qualitative, you can see that there are some differences. And of course, mixed methods is in the middle. Now, this doesn't mean this is fixed, but this is a kind of framework of kind of understanding how to think through, or when you're trained as a quantitative person, how can you shift to understanding qualitative or sitting in the middle? So this is a really nice model that Daniel and Harlan developed to help sort of see the ways in which constructions of meanings of how we understand what's out there differs from a quantitative to a qualitative lens. I highlight these sections here because I think this is really important when we're thinking about the work that we do, particularly in psychology, because these are the real sort of the explanatory, hypothesis, objectives, standardized, value fee, rigorous, number crunching. Those are real central characteristics which psychology likes to embrace, as particularly when they're trying to frame it as a field that is objective and as a science. And so qualitative pushes us to think differently when we're doing psychology research, but that's using qualitative methods. And this is where sometimes people get uncomfortable. So it's not about the qualitative research itself that people struggle with. Often it's just about the ontological and epistemological features that people struggle with, because it's a way of thinking about things differently and thinking about research and how we come about knowledge differently. And that's what you have to sort of get comfortable. And so we talk about the traditions in which we approach research. And so we have epistemological stances. And again, we talked about this earlier, your positivism or interpretism. And if you're positivism, that's where things are kind of fixed, verifiable, very logical. And the social realm in terms of interpretism is that there's a lot, I use the term noise, that there are different ways of seeing things. And you have to approach things differently because people have different interpretations. There's different ways to coming to knowledge. And in the middle is where you put both of these together, and that's pragmatics. And that's typically mixed methods. So if you're looking at that again, positivism is really embraced by the quantitative tradition, while interpretivism is really by the qualitative position. So let's be really clear about what we're talking about here. So ontology, I really like this quote. It's the claims and assumptions that are made about the nature of social reality. Claims about what exists, what it looks like, what units make it up, and how these units interact with each other. In short, ontological assumptions are concerned with what we believe constitutes social reality. So think about it as the description. How do you describe what's there? And it also includes the values that are part of that description. So it's just not what it looks like, but also what's included, how it interacts, and how does it create a reality of understanding something. Epistemology is more about how we gain knowledge about that. So how do we understand how that knowledge was created, and how do we know what is known in terms of the ways in which this knowledge was gained and constructed? So it's important to understand our own epistemology and ontology because this really helps us understand the ways in which we're approaching research. And this is different from theory and the ways in which we look at phenomenon. It's basically about how we are trained and how we see the world from a real sort of research perspective. So our epistemological assumptions are really guided by three overarching terms: objectivity, constructionist, and subjectivity. And so typically you fall into one of these. So objectivity believes that knowledge exists whether we are conscious of it or not, that there is just a fixed reality that's out there, and that's something that we either know it or we're going to come to know it. Constructivist asserts that we come to gather knowledge through interactions. So there isn't one fixed knowledge, but there is something that it's created through this. It's constructed through interactions, and that also shapes the ways that we look at this. Now, subjectivity is that there isn't this, it might be somewhat constructed, but really everybody has a different understanding of it because of our subjective positionality, which is what in our earlier lecture they're about subjectivity, positionality, reflexivity. This is where you have to think about different people have a different understanding about knowledge. And so these are sort of three overarching epistemological assumptions which people kind of fit into or float between depending on the question or phenomena that's being studied. So for example, objectivity is very central in behavior analysis research, right? And so you can there's these set behaviors, and it doesn't matter where you are. This is sort of how it structures in terms of Pavlov's dogs. And so it differs again depending on where you are. So sit and think for a second. When you're thinking about your epistemological assumptions, which one do you think, in terms of your dissertation project, really sort of guides how you're looking at things right now? And again, this might change over time. Are you centering objectivity, constructionist, or subjectivity positions? So again, we're going back to looking at this model here and centering the centrality of philosophical assumptions. And so after you thought through those three frameworks in terms of your epistemological positionality right now, this will help us then move into different types of approaches to understanding our own philosophical assumptions. So here's a way of breaking things down in terms of different types of assumptions, what kinds of questions are answered by these assumptions, or what it critiques, what are the characteristics and implications, and this is for research projects. So if we're thinking about ontological assumptions, it really questions what is the nature of reality? What is reality? And remember we said, what are the pieces that are part of it? And then ontological frameworks would say that reality is seen through many views. So there's multiple ways of looking at it from a qualitative standpoint. If we're looking at epistemological, it questions what counts as knowledge. So how do we construct knowledge? How are knowledge claims justified? What's the relationship between the researcher and what is being researched? So it's really questioning the ways in which we've created or come to know that knowledge. And so again, the example that's really tied to this is overarching is, how is reality known? Axiological is another assumption that can frame into here, and that is, what is the role of value? So that's not just about your positionality, but the values tied to this. What are your biases? What are the ways in which you're giving meaning to these or giving weight? And so when you're thinking about this, this is where researchers have to acknowledge biases or the values that are present in their relationship to their research or the study context. And in qualitative, we openly discuss this. This is important. You don't try to erase it, because this also gives more honesty and transparency in terms of the research process, which is critically important when you think about the role of the researcher in qualitative research. And then the methodological, which we're going to talk about, this is different than the method. This is, what is the proofs of the researcher? So what is the position in terms of the theoretical lens through which the researcher approaches this work. This, again, is not how they do it in terms of focus groups or individual interviews. It's sort of like to use inductive logic, where you're trying to figure things out. So you're looking for what guides how you think about finding this knowledge. And this is something that you have to think about when you start approaching how you're going to do your research. Now, these are big assumptions that we use when we're thinking about our philosophical assumptions. So these are the different things that you would go through to sort of go through the ways in which you're approaching your research. But if we want to actually give it a language in terms of a framework, there are different types that exist. So one is post-positivism, and this is where the research goals, which is different, is to discover what contributes to various situations. And so this is something where you're thinking about the researcher influences, who you are, and what's going forward. And so this is very much post-positivism, is really looking where there are things that are fixed, but you're looking at what's happening within that fixed situation. And you're very systematic in ways you're doing things, and the procedures are very structured of how you go forward with it. Social constructivism is where you want to understand the world in which the people live that you're doing your work. And so you look at the noise again. So what's the background? What's occurring around people that sort of shape the ways in which the information or knowledge is being interpreted? So it's really about interpreting participants' constructions of meanings. Now, again, going back to, remember, we talked about the beliefs in terms of your philosophical frameworks, and we said there's ontological, epistemological, axiological, and methodological. Well, looking at post-positivism, you could see that they're really framed in multiple ways here. What I'm going to do is ask you to actually pause here and read through each of these. And in our upcoming class, we're going to discuss these each. And I want you to think about, are you most positivist or social constructivist when you're looking at each of these four categories of philosophical assumptions? So please pause here and read through this and think about where you are on this. And again, the chapter really goes more in depth around this discussion, but you've kind of already gotten the foundation from earlier pieces. Okay, so these are sort of two frameworks. Again, we talked about positive and social constructivism, which in some ways, I don't want to say that they're polar opposites, but they have very different ways of looking at things. And so some of you might have said, this doesn't really fit me on either way. And that's okay, because there are different types of interpretive frameworks that are really common and popular in qualitative research today. So one might be transformative frameworks, postmodern perspectives, and pragmatism. And so what you'll find is that there are different research goals, and there's different research influences and different practices for doing these. So you might not be post-positivist or social constructivist, but maybe one of these transformative frameworks, postmodern perspectives, or pragmatism aligns more closely with the way you're seeing the world. So again, going back to those four philosophical pieces that we talked about earlier, you can see when I just used the example here of just transformative and pragmatism, I didn't do positivism here, but you can pull that from the book. You can see in ways the which these two have different frameworks about what creates how we see knowledge in terms of knowledge reality. How do we understand the process with how that reality was created? What values are informing this way of creating knowledge, and how do you approach finding out more to address this? And that aligns most closely with your philosophical assumptions. And you could see that laid out here. This is important to be able to understand these four pieces and be able to articulate it when you're moving forward with research. And I would encourage ASCP students, this would be something to think about as a question that would be useful when you're asked about your philosophical assumptions in the qualifying exam oral discussion. Again, I'm adding even more interpretive frameworks on top of this, and you, of course, can dig more in depth. But for example, you also have feminist theories, critical theory or critical race theories, queer theory, disability theories, And again, you could see that there are different researcher goals, researcher influences, and examples of research praxis. And why I broke it down this way is because you could see over time, you will become more in tune with specific philosophical assumptions and different interpretive frameworks as you gain more knowledge, as you get more involved in your field, as you start understanding your question. And so again, even within this class, your philosophical assumptions might shift, even from the beginning of this lecture to now, because you're being forced to think about it in a way that often in more traditional science that claims to be objective doesn't even have these discussions. And so it's important to think about your interpretive frameworks when you're going forward, because this is part of understanding who you are as a researcher as it brings to the actual research process. So these philosophical assumptions are important. And again, those four frameworks of understanding your belief systems are critical for thinking about it here in terms of ontological beliefs, epistemological beliefs, axiological beliefs, and methodological beliefs. So again, you can look at here that for feminist critical race theory or critical theories, queer theory, and disability theories, there is a similarity in terms of the philosophical assumptions around these four belief frameworks, but how you use them will really depend on what question or what's your point of interest for approaching it. And again, I'm going to leave this here because this might be something that's better for you to discuss or think about as you're moving forward with your own research. And we can discuss this in the class when we meet for the lecture. I know this seminar had a lot of depth to think about, but I think it's important to recognize you don't have to memorize or get sitting and fixed in something and trying to identify right now, but you need to know how to think about these things and go back and articulate them as it particularly relates to your research project. And also, again, going back to that model, it's ongoing. This is something that you have to keep reflecting on and going back to throughout the qualitative research process. So don't feel overwhelmed and panicking about this, but know where this is a starting point for moving forward and something that you need to revisit and start getting comfortable with and articulating. And again, while it's important qualitative, it's also useful to think about even when you're doing other types of research approaches. Of obviously with mixed methods, you will need it, but even for quantitative, I should say, this is something that's really important to understand in terms of your philosophy of how knowledge is come to understood and then used in the field. That's it. And I hope you guys have a great week.